All right, welcome to the first episode of the Case for Separate Ancestry. So this is Donny, and again, this will be episode 1 of a very important ongoing series that discusses the topic of ancestry. One could say the great ancestry debate in great detail. And so your two models are universal ancestry, which would basically say that all life, including humans, chimpanzees, whales, and strawberries, are related through common ancestry. Separate ancestry would say that there exist distinct boundaries, what we as a biblical creationist would call a kind boundary. And specifically when focusing on humans, we would argue that humans are created special, but also created separate from any other form of life. That would include any of your great apes, right? Your chimpanzee, your gorilla, your orangutan, your bonobo. And what this series is going to do is provide overwhelming evidence for the separate ancestry model. And it's going to be a lengthy series. I am going to essentially touch on everything on the topic of ancestry. And I spend hours a day watching and studying lectures from the other side, and I make sure that they're the most up-to-date lectures. And when I say the other side, I'm talking about human origins, out of Africa, genetics, ancient DNA, and these kinds of fields and topics. And so this series is going to give you the most up-to-date case, one could say, for separate ancestry. And let's just get right into it. So this is episode 1, a literal Adam and Eve. I have written numerous books. As a ministry, we've published about 15 or 16. I personally have written about 8 now, and several on this specific topic. So here's the special creation book, Dismantling Evolution and Confirming Independent Origins. And so I've got a physical copy right here. I highly recommend it. Currently, it's at about 300 pages, and it's updated and expanded, and I will continue to update it and expand it as more data comes in. It's a great time to be a biblical creationist. And I've also got the Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook. So I've done a ton of study on endogenous retroviruses specifically, and the topic of ancestry in general. As the head of a ministry that has put out an evolution debate challenge, we put it out at the very end of 2021, and we started at the very beginning of 2022, January 2022. So we're coming up at a year now. We've done over 50 debates in terms of that challenge. And one argument that comes up almost every debate, at least with the more informed evolutionists, are endogenous retroviruses. And so I took it upon myself to therefore write a comprehensive book. This is about 200 pages. And so in this book, you'll find the most thorough explanation of endogenous retroviruses when it comes to the separate ancestry model that's out there. As a matter of fact, in my study for this book, and in my study as I was writing this book, I didn't come across really anything, even from the evolutionist side, that is as thorough as this book on the endogenous retrovirus topic. So I could be wrong on that. I haven't seen everything out there, but the point is I highly recommend it. I would say for both creationists and evolutionists. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get right into it. And we can see here the separate ancestry model. The Bible claims to be the history book of the universe. And so when we start from the Bible And here are several passages directly from the scriptures. Okay, this verse, for example, here, Genesis 2:7. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. This verse is clearly telling us that man was created separately from any other form of life. And this includes your great apes. This includes your whales. This includes your pine trees. This verse right here, Genesis 2:21-22 says, and the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman and brought her unto the man. So what we can see here in Genesis 2:7 and Genesis 2:21-22 is the special and separate creation of man and woman, Adam and Eve, separate in the sense that they're created separate from any other form of life. Again, this includes the great apes. This includes grass. The Bible clearly teaches special creation and separate ancestry. And again, since the Bible claims to be the history book of the universe, we should be able to examine its claims to modern scientific data. And it turns out that the scientific data overwhelmingly, irrefutably confirms the biblical model of ancestry, as this series is going to demonstrate. Notice this, Adam and Eve, the first couple. Genesis 5:2, male and female created he them and blessed them and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. Mark 10 says, so we see no hint at all in the creation account of humans essentially evolving out of pre-human populations. Mark 10:6. From the mouth of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ himself, God manifests in the flesh. But from the beginning of the creation, referring back to the creation week, referring back to the verses that we've just read, God made them, who? Adam and Eve, male and female. Genesis 3:20, and Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Obviously, context tells us that the all living refers to all of mankind and not your dogs and plants and so on and so forth. So Eve is the mother of all living. 1 Corinthians 15 says, and so it is written, the first man, Adam, was made a living soul. So do you see how all of these scriptures corroborate each other? And they all represent one foundational truth, that God created humans separate from any other form of life. Now, we've spent hours and hours on this channel refuting the theistic evolutionists, the old earth creationists, those that would compromise these teachings. And so I'm not going to spend time here refuting those arguments, but I will say this. Your theistic evolutionists, let's say your prominent ones, they're going to twist and they're going to turn these scriptures on their head. They're going to twist them. They're going to say they're not saying what they're actually saying, basically. Okay, because they want to force fit a quote unquote theory, fish to fisherman evolution, universal common ancestry, into the Bible where it doesn't belong. Now, the problem for them, and I've witnessed this now for 4 years since I started this ministry, is your most adamant theistic evolutionists. They have never actually addressed the scientific lines of evidence for separate ancestry. So the point is, we don't need to twist these verses. We don't need to look to these theistic evolutionists to take these verses that anybody can understand and essentially argue that they're not saying what they're really saying here. Because the modern scientific data confirms the truth of these passages, that we really all do descend from just two people, Adam and Eve. And those two people are not related to any other form of life. So we don't need to reinterpret this, since today in 2022, the scientific data, especially in genetics, guys, this series is going to focus heavily on genetics. The reason why is because it's in genetics, it's in our DNA, that we can best answer this question of ancestry. Universal, that says whales and pine trees are related, or separate ancestry, that says humans are created separately from any other form of life. That includes whales and pine trees. Well, it's in our DNA that we can best answer this question, because it's genetics that are passed on sperm and egg. A rock is not passed on sperm and egg. The horribly sloppy hermeneutics of theistic evolutionists are not passed on sperm and egg, that's for sure. Geography is not passed on sperm and egg. A fossil is not passed on sperm and egg. And therefore, we can directly answer this question of ancestry in our DNA. And we're just beginning to understand the DNA language. And so this series is going to focus heavily on DNA function, the overturning of junk DNA. I'm going to refute the critics. I've had 100 formal debates. I've just recently had my 100th formal debate with an evolutionist named Grayson on this topic. And I've debated PhD scientists on this issue. I've been doing it now for 4 years. I've seen all of their arguments. I've seen all of their rescue devices. I've engaged them for hours and hours and hours and hours, endlessly. Okay, so I'm going to leave no stone unturned. So your evolutionists that want to, comment on this video and leave this rescue device and that rescue device, it's going to be demolished in this series. This series is leaving no stone unturned. I've got enough experience to know that this series will provide undeniable evidence for separate ancestry to the objective thinker. Those that are actually willing to listen, willing to learn, and willing to challenge their worldview. Okay, so what do we have here? We have the separate ancestry model. As you can see, we've got humans, and there will be an episode or two on the so-called hominid fossil record as well, where I'm going to get into Neanderthals. I'm going to get into your various so-called pre-humans that you can see here on the chart, like Naledi, Hobbit, or Homo floresiensis, Denisovans, Erectus, so on and so forth, okay? And I am going to show you how these so-called pre-humans, they're not pre-human at all, they're fully human, fit into the separate ancestry model. And just over the course of the last week, I've watched and studied at least a dozen lectures, new lectures, novel lectures, I would say, from at least the past month, from world famous paleoanthropologists and geneticists, and those studying ancestry from genetics. And it's amazing how much they actually admit in these lectures, admit to what they don't know. And it's funny because the questions that they have, that they're searching far and wide for an answer, the separate ancestry model has the answers. And this series, this ongoing series, is going to demonstrate that. Okay, so clearly here, just a very basic representation of the separate ancestry model. You can see ape in red, man in blue, and you can see how all of these human variants go back to just two people, Adam and Eve. And you can see how everything in the human category, the humankind, is separated from everything in the ape kind. Now, evolutionists and taxonomists, of course, it's very arbitrary, these classification systematics. They'll say that humans are human great apes. And then your great apes, like your gorillas, your chimpanzees, orangutans, Australopithecines, they're non-human great apes. So they would argue that based on taxonomy, classification systems, that humans are an ape. But we're going to demonstrate that taxonomy and arguing from the ability to classify organisms, which will be an episode all to its own. But I'm going to demonstrate how fallacious that is. Okay, so here you can see the branching tree. We've got the common ancestor there all the way at the bottom. And the universal common ancestry model would suggest that from that last universal common ancestor comes your fish, your amphibians, your marsupials, humans there at the top, chimpanzees, whales, so on and so forth. So the universal tree of life, it's Darwin that says, it's an amazing fact, I'm just paraphrasing, that all plants and animals should be related. So right here, the tree of life, where you've got everything connected. So whether it's an elephant here and a whale here, both mammals, connected to branches that go back to previous common ancestors and your origin of life all the way down here. So again, the universal common ancestry model would say that all life is related. Here's a massive phylogenetic tree that is a sophisticated representation of what they believe in terms of how everything is related. Your mammals, your birds, your reptiles. Think of it like this: farm, fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and then eventually higher mammals like humans. That's essentially the order they believe in terms of the evolutionary history of life. So this says the tree of life, we are related to everything. So that's what they believe. And most informed evolutionists will admit this. I have had the occasional rare but fun and entertaining impromptu debate, I would say. We engage in a lot of open mics, panel discussions. So I don't consider those formal debates. So when I say 100 formal debates, I really mean 100 formal debates. But if I were to consider all of the impromptu open mic discussions, panel discussions where evolutionists would join basically to scoff, but then get refuted, it would be between 200 and 300. And so again, I've got enough experience to know how these evolutionists think and what arguments they'll put forth. So once in a while, you get the rare occasion where you have an evolutionist who says, no, I'm not related to a strawberry. I'm not related to a whale. But in reality, it's exactly what they believe. So a lot of evolutionists, unfortunately, don't fully understand what they believe. So oftentimes you have to teach them or tell them what they believe. And so they most certainly would believe that they, being a human, and grass go back to a common ancestor, where the separate ancestry model would say differently. Okay. So what I do want to point out is the fact that the word evolution can be kind of slippery. So it's not that, though, the proponents of separate ancestry would deny evolution, because it's all going to depend on what you mean by evolution. So a good question to ask an evolutionist when engaging in a discussion is, what do you mean by evolution? Because typically, if by evolution you mean change over time, right? My phones change over time. In my lifetime, I've had a dozen phones, and each phone has changed. It's improved, essentially. And cars change, our thinking changes, things change. So we're not disagreeing with that. When it comes to biological evolution, most evolutionists will agree that evolution simply means a change in allele frequencies in populations over time or over generations. Allele, fancy word, just means the fact that genes come in different forms, genetic variants, flavors of a gene, one could say. And then frequency just refers to the frequency of that allele or variant in a population. Could be at a high frequency, could be at a low frequency. We are going to discuss in great detail over the course of this series why allele frequencies, the distribution of these alleles in human populations, is actually testimony to the out of Babel dispersal and the biblical model of ancestry in general. So yes, we believe in change. We believe in changes in allele frequencies. Okay. What we don't believe is by changing, that necessarily means dogs and banana plants are related through common ancestry. If you're going to say that dogs, wolves, coyotes are related, yeah, we're not going to have a problem with that, okay? But if you're going to say that dogs, wolves, coyotes, and banana plants are related, well, yes, that is where the evolutionist has now left science. They've entered their philosophy. And unfortunately for them, most, if not all, of the arguments to say that because life changes, that means all life is related, It's actually the result of a fallacy, an extrapolation fallacy. Okay, so right here, as you can see, is, and this is going to go back to a model that I want everybody to be very familiar with. So I'm going to cover it here a little bit in this first episode. So this is called either the design diversity hypothesis, or the fancy way of describing it, the created heterozygosity hypothesis. And the word heterozygosity essentially means a state of DNA diversity where DNA copies are different. Okay. If you have an area in the genome where your DNA copies are different, that's in a heterozygous state. And a good way to look at it is by looking to basic genetics and alleles. Okay, we have uppercase A, lowercase a, uppercase B, lowercase b. That means you're heterozygous at that genetic loci or location. But if you're capital A, capital A, capital B, well, then you're homozygous because your DNA copies are the same. They're in a homozygous state. And so as you can see here, you've got your two scenarios where we have a heterozygous state in scenario 1 and a heterozygous state in scenario 2. Well, here's the thing. If you have heterozygous ancestors, an almost limitless assortment of combinations of chromosomes, genes, and traits are feasible, can come about quickly. Well, that's exactly what the design diversity hypothesis suggests. So we as biblical creationists, most of us would argue that Adam and Eve were created with DNA differences within themselves and across themselves, between themselves. This would also apply universal population, original created phyelid population, original created canid kind. These would be created heterozygous, where they have millions of positions in the genome where you have capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b, rather than capital A, capital A, capital B, capital B. The Bible tells us God commands us to be fruitful and multiply, commands Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. The command, fulfilling that command would make zero sense if Adam and Eve and the created kinds of animals were designed with high levels of homozygosity. That would imply that the command is be fruitful and clone yourselves. No, that doesn't make any sense. To be fruitful and multiply and to have variation on the planet, what makes most sense scientifically and therefore theologically as well, since the command to be fruitful and multiply is found in the Bible, would be that God created Adam and Eve and the original created kinds in a state of heterozygosity. And so you have this heterozygosity, and it is applied to millions of positions within the genome. And through processes like recombination, where these design variants can be shuffled up, and gene conversion, which essentially can shuffle up single nucleotides, you get new chromosomal combinations and new varieties of traits, of combinations of traits quickly. You can get novel morphologies because that diversity is pre-existing. It is manifested essentially. And it's the evolutionary model. They explain the vast majority of DNA differences, autosomal nuclear DNA differences, as being the result of mutations over time. So they need millions of years for novel variations, for an increase in phenotypic complexity. But if the DNA differences are already built in, front-loaded at the start, then we don't need, as biblical creationists, millions of years to add the necessary variation for change based on mutations. It's already built in. So in a single generation, you can have the recombining of these created variants, these beneficial variants, and it would lead to variation quickly. Because again, these DNA differences are built in. And that's where, and I'm going to have an entire episode on it, that's where predictions come into play. Predictions on DNA function. If created heterozygosity is true, and Adam and Eve were created in a state of heterozygosity, we would predict that the vast majority of DNA sequences, DNA differences, DNA elements like endogenous retroviruses, allele sequences, pseudogenes would actually represent functional DNA elements. I'm here to tell you right now that that is the case. And it's only getting better more and more as more papers come about every single month, essentially. But that the details of that will be saved for another episode. And okay, with a little background and kind of setting up for this episode, we're just going to get right into the fun here. Okay, so this right here is a Y chromosome phylogenetic tree. And it is a tree of all the major Y chromosome families in the world. This was specifically created by Dr. Robert Carter. And I will recommend, obviously, books and papers throughout this series. But here's one that I highly recommend to get a really good idea in terms of what's going on here. This paper by Dr. Sanford and Dr. Carter, an overview of the independent histories of the human Y chromosome and the human mitochondrial chromosome. So I've got the paper in front of me. And if you like physical copies like me, when I'm reading and studying a really long paper, I prefer to have the physical copy because it gives me a break from screens. As people know, especially as YouTube streamers, content creators, writers, all the books I've written, you spend a lot of time looking at screens. So any reason to get away from screens for a bit is great. Great for the eyes, I'll say that. And so I like physical books, physical copies of papers. So again, I do recommend this because I will be referring to these phylogenetic trees quite frequently in this series. So firstly, I just want to say in a nutshell, we have two ancestors. One Y chromosome ancestor, one mitochondrial DNA ancestor. That's it. One worldwide Y chromosome, one worldwide mitochondrial genome. And you can take every single Y chromosome on the planet, and every single Y chromosome is nearly identical, 99.999% the same. No matter what two Y chromosomes you're looking at, you can build a family tree, and every single male Y chromosome. Now, I should say your Y chromosome and your mitochondrial DNA, they are what are called uniparentally inherited DNA compartments. So the Y chromosomes pass down on the father's side. I got my Y chromosome from my dad. If you're a male, you got the Y chromosome from your dad. Mitochondrial DNA, on the other hand, although uniparentally inherited, mitochondrial DNA is inherited from the mother's side. Okay, so these are portions of the genome that are inherited by either the father's side or the mother's side. And every single generation, for the most part, you get mistakes. And so you can take those mistakes and essentially track them back to a past common ancestor. And we have one most recent Y chromosomal ancestor just 4,500 years ago. And this shouldn't be the case if human evolution is true, if deep time evolution is true. And so firstly, I do want to focus on the Y chromosome, and then I'm going to get into the mitochondrial DNA, both of these uniparentally inherited DNA compartments. That is comparing to the biparentally inherited DNA compartments, or autosomal DNA. For example, that DNA compartment, we inherit roughly 100 new mutations per person, per individual, okay, per generation. 50 roughly from mom, 50 from dad. When it comes to the Y chromosome, you're getting about 1 to 3 per generation. And in the mitochondrial DNA, you're getting about 0.1 to 0.5 per generation. But I'm going to get into that. But the point is, it's high. The mutation rates are high overall. But yet we have low variation, incredibly low variation. As a matter of fact, I just did an impromptu debate, actually, on the out of Africa theory and the out of Africa bottleneck. And I point out an excellent line of evidence for separate ancestry and a literal Adam and Eve is the fact that all humans are nearly identical genetically. We have what's called low genetic diversity. Any two people on this planet, genetically, nearly identical. Now, here's the thing. If God created two people, Adam and Eve, just 6,000 years ago, what does that do? That automatically restricts genetic variation. And so what would we expect as biblical creationists? We would expect low variation in humans today. That's exactly what we find. It was a shock. It was a surprise to the evolutionary community. Think about it. If the evolutionary story is true and humans go back about 200,000 years ago to an out of Africa scenario, and even before that, humans go back to Erectus, go back to habilis, go back to Australopithecine-like ancestors that are on this planet for millions of years. Well, that's millions of years of what? Mutation accumulation. If every single generation we're accumulating mutations, and mutations add something new because it's adding something that was not previously there. Now, I'm not saying it's adding or increasing phenotypic complexity, adding body plans. No, I'm just saying it adds diversity. Diversity that was not previously there. This type of diversity that mutations add is akin to the dents, the dings, the scratches, the rust marks on your car, or typographical errors in a text. Yes, over time, the text is getting more diverse from its original form, and your car is getting more diverse from its original form, but it's not getting more diverse in a good way. It's actually getting more diverse in a worse way because it's accumulating damage, but more diverse nonetheless. And so you'd have a lot of genes floating around in the evolutionary story, put it that way. And so their expectation was and should be high levels of genetic diversity, not low levels of genetic diversity. The low levels of genetic diversity in humans is exactly what we would expect as a biblical creation. So the evolutionary community, they had to invoke an out of Africa population bottleneck. Essentially a rescue device. It's post hoc, it's ad hoc. And why they invoke this is to explain the low levels of diversity in human mitochondrial DNA, Y-chromosome, autosomal DNA. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work because this bottleneck in Africa that would have had humans reduced to, let's say, between 2 and 10,000 people, some say as much as 30,000 people, it would have had to be not a one generation bottleneck like the biblical bottlenecks, a long-term population bottleneck that experiences severe inbreeding in order to reduce necessary levels of heterozygosity and increase the necessary levels of homozygosity to explain the levels of genetic variation today. You'd have to have an extended population bottleneck with inbreeding. But the problem is what results from inbreeding is the manifestation of deleterious alleles that have accumulated over time, and they lead to rapid and exponential genetic degeneration. Diseases are manifested. Inbreeding is not good. Inbreeding reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes that have accumulated over time. And so rather than being a beneficial bottleneck, because these evolutionists want to say sometime after this bottleneck, human beings exploded out of Africa. They exploded into all parts of the globe and seized dominion over the planet. And today we've got the space shuttle, airplanes, cars, computers, smartphones. I'm recording a presentation here over my laptop, over StreamYard, and all of this out of a near extinction event. No, this inbreeding, this subsequent inbreeding would have left that population of 2 to 10,000 incredibly genetically compromised. And so there's no way they're going to spread out into all parts of the world and seize dominion over the planet. We have an example today. Cheetahs are down to 7,000 roughly. 10,000 years ago, now 7,000. Their population is declining. They have a lot of genetic related diseases that have manifested. Their sperm is degenerate. Conservationists are incredibly worried about the cheetah. We're not going to suddenly expect to see the cheetahs spread out into all parts of the globe and seize dominion over the planet. That's a little tongue in cheek, but essentially this is what the evolutionary community wants us to believe with their out of Africa fairy tale. And that precludes their out of Africa story entirely because they don't have any real empirical reasons for us to believe that there was this near extinction event where humans were reduced to between 2 and 10,000, and they had a multi-generational bottleneck where there was inbreeding. But we know that that inbreeding would have left that population of humans at that time genetically compromised. And so it's not feasible. It doesn't work. It's a story. It's post hoc, ad hoc. Evolution's dead. I'm sorry. Okay, so that's just genetic variation in general. Now, on to, that was a bit of a rabbit trail, but I'm going to be doing a lot in this series. I don't want it to be incredibly scripted, this series. And so I have the points per episode that I want to touch on, but certain things are going to come to mind. Guys, this is a heavy topic. It's why I've written so many books on it. There's just so much evidence for the biblical creation model. Sometimes it's difficult to even decide, what am I going to limit this episode to? So this is where I really want to touch on the phylogenetic trees here, okay? So again, this was created by Dr. Rob Carter, and it is a reflection of Y chromosomal diversity worldwide. There's history on this tree. But looking at this tree specifically, we actually see evidence for a rapidly growing population. Now think about this. The Bible tells us that God created two people, Adam and Eve, 6,000 years ago. That's two people. But what follows the creation of two people is rapid and exponential population growth. And then 2,000 years later at the flood, the human population is reduced to 8. Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives. Okay, that's interesting. But what follows that is, again, rapid and exponential population growth. Now, for a few hundred years after the flood, they don't spread out in all parts of the planet. They isolate at the Tower of Babel. Then the languages are confused, and then they spread out in all parts of the globe. And that's where we can get into things like Y chromosomal DNA differences, and how we have very specific, we have geographically specific Y chromosomes. Asian Y chromosomes, African Y chromosomes, European Y chromosomes. And the reason we have this is because after Babel, you have different people groups with the male lineages essentially leading the way into all parts of the world. And so as people groups spread out and become isolated rather than all being an intermingling population, that means they're going to accumulate their own independent mutations. And that's what's interesting, is the Y chromosome has incredibly low variation. And so if deep time evolution was true, and we've had people groups spread out in all parts of the globe accumulating their own mutations, then we should have some highly divergent Y chromosomes on the planet. And yet we don't find that. And so the evolutionists are really, really stuck here. And allele frequencies, okay, we find a lot of rare alleles. If it's rare, we know it's new. It's newer, I should say. And the allele distribution around the planet, and even just the evidence for population growth, that hockey stick shape, where we have a rapidly expanding population with today only 7 to 8 billion people, that can easily go back 4,500 years to the original 8 people off of the ark. There should be way more people. There should be way more people if deep time evolution was true. And they're going to chalk it up to, agriculture and just the ability of humans to finally start living basically a healthier life. Okay. There's a lot of rescue devices involved in it, but the genetic data refutes it, because again, we should have some highly divergent Y chromosomes. We don't see that. We see geographically specific Y chromosomes, which is testimony to the out of Babel dispersal event, but also low variation. Exactly what we would expect. And we're going to be wrapping up this show with the chimpanzee, and the fact that when you consider overall gene content, architecture, and size differences, you actually have a Y chromosome between the humans and chimpanzees that's only 35% the same. So every single human male Y chromosome, 99.999% the same. But you throw chimpanzees in there, and now it's 35% the same. And the evolutionists just can't figure it out. The reason why this is, why the human Y chromosome and chimpanzee Y chromosomes are so different, is because we're not related, separate ancestry. But anyways, we'll get into that in a little bit. So what you'll notice is the starburst pattern. And this is simply evidence of a rapidly expanding population, just as the Bible would predict. Adam and Eve, rapidly expanding population bottleneck, and then another rapidly expanding population. Okay, and all these haplogroups go back to common ancestors, the number of haplogroups, the DNA differences separating them. It's all consistent with the creation of Adam and Eve just 6,000 years ago, but more specifically, the flood bottleneck and then the out of Babel dispersal event. It's fascinating stuff. Okay, so we have the starburst pattern, which is evidence of a rapidly expanding population. And the branches themselves, what they reflect is random mutations in people over time. Now, Noah would be somewhere in the middle. But for various reasons that I'm going to get into, we can't necessarily know for sure where the root is from the creationist position. Now, your evolutionists, they're going to they're going to put their root here somewhere on the African line. Okay. And they're basing that on several assumptions. They're basing that on, an evolutionary molecular clock, the fact that Africans have more genetic diversity. They assume ape to man evolution. There's a number of assumptions that we're going to touch on. But most importantly, when it comes to variation, remember the Y chromosome has incredibly low variation, and this tree only represents a few hundred mutations. In the overall scheme of things, that's just a few DNA differences separating any two people. It's not a lot at all. And even in your longest branches, yes, there's more, let's say over 400, but overall, humans have low variation. This wasn't expected or predicted. Okay. And when it comes to the mutation rates, we can measure mutation rates. This is called the empirical method, or the pedigree method, where we can take the sequences of, let's say, two parents and their child. And by doing this, we can count up, they've done this, there's a number of papers, they count up the mutations, right? They're measuring the number of mutations or differences the child has that the parents don't have, comparing children to parents. And you can get grandparents involved as well, and you can get an even more accurate mutation rate, essentially, pedigree rate. Okay. And when doing this, the Y chromosome has about one mutation per generation. But when you actually look at high sequencing data, it turns out that the Y chromosome is even faster than ever predicted. It's actually about 3 per generation. Whether it's 1 or 3 per generation, it's too fast for the evolutionary model, because the evolutionist wants to take this tree back about 200,000 years, but it's only a reflection of 200 to 300 generations. It's only reflecting, 4,000 to 6,000 years rather than 200,000 years. There's very few DNA differences separating any two people, low variation. The mutation rate is fast. So the only way to explain a Y chromosome worldwide in men that's basically the same, we have one Y chromosome worldwide that's shared, but with a fast mutation rate, the only way to explain that is by understanding the Y chromosome is young. You can't have a fast mutation rate and low variation and then take that Y chromosome back 200,000 years. No, because there would be highly divergent Y chromosome groups. There would be high diversity. There's every reason to believe that you would have multiple lines. See, the evolutionary community, they invoke something called coalescence, but has many faulty assumptions. One assumption, for the most part, is they'll assume random mating. But historically, that's not true. You've had people groups that have existed in tribes, and for the most part, they've intermingled and intermarried within those tribes. And so you have many different Y chromosome groups and lineages. Okay. But they want to say, no, that they all coalesce to one. No, that's not a natural prediction of the evolutionary model, because historically people have married within their tribes. Okay. If you have marriages going on, people in Australia and Africa, there's not random mating. Okay. So everything about the evolutionary model just has unprovable and unrealistic assumptions, unfortunately. So we've got a fast mutation rate. We've got low variation. The same thing goes for the mitochondrial DNA, as I'm going to touch on in a little bit. Okay. The mutation rate in the mitochondrial DNA is, as fast as 0.5 per generation, or 1 every other generation. And the mitochondrial DNA compartment is only about 16,000 letters long. It's a very small piece of DNA. And so that's fast. That's fast. But with this Y chromosome, okay, since we're looking at a mutation rate that's basically 3 per generation when considering high quality data, and what we're seeing here is essentially only a few hundred generations worth of time, since there's only a few mutations overall, it's incredibly easy to fit this number of mutations with a fast mutation rate in 4,500 to 6,000 years. Very, very easy. We have one Y chromosomal ancestor. People who know their Bible know that this would be Y chromosome Noah, who's probably a few mutations removed from Adam. Okay, so it's very easy to explain the amount of variation and the mutation rate in biblical time. This is amazing evidence for the separate ancestry model. So again, as I pointed out earlier, guys, the basics of the Y chromosome is that it's passed down from father to son. It is male-specific, uniparentally inherited DNA. Okay, it's nuclear DNA, but it's uniparentally inherited. Your mitochondrial DNA, uniparentally inherited as well. Now, when it comes to, let's see, here's the mitochondrial DNA, okay? When it comes to this specific kind of DNA, again, it's a small little DNA compartment that's passed down on the mother's side. And you can do the same here. Dr. Rob Carter has done it here as well. And he's taken worldwide mitochondrial DNA diversity. He's built a family tree. Okay. And similar to the Y chromosome family tree, we see what? We see that starburst pattern. We see evidence for an expanding population, a rapidly expanding population. And this explosive growth is actually from a center point. You can see that right from the center point here. And then you see the branches, I should say, naturally spreading out. Because your critics, and this was a major argument in my debate with Grayson, they'll argue, oh, you know, this is an unrooted tree. You're supposed to root it. But then you ask them why, and you see that they're basing it on constant mutation rates, which I'm about to refute here. They're basing it on, it's circular, because they're assuming that the unrooted tree that we're representing here, which is a natural reflection of the data, because the rooted tree obscures the fact that we have variable mutation rates. And they have no justification for where they root it. For example, they'll root the mitochondrial DNA tree, same thing, on the L0 node here and somewhere in the middle. Okay. And it's based on DNA variation. It's based on a constant mutation rate. Okay. So again, the unrooted tree allows the branches to naturally spread out, and therefore it is a more natural reflection of the data versus the rooted tree that the evolutionists root based on their assumptions or evolutionary assumptions, and it becomes more artificial where the branches aren't naturally spreading out. And so it obscures the mutation rates that are actually variable. Okay, so again, in this tree, in the Y chromosome tree, what we have is the explosion. And this is evidence for a rapidly growing population where we have the ancestors somewhere in the middle. But for many reasons, it's difficult for the creationists to pick the root. It's also difficult, almost impossible, for the evolutionists to pick the root. And this specific paper here that I recommend touches on all that, okay? So when I recommend certain papers and books, I definitely want you guys to check them out. Okay, so when it comes to the mitochondrial DNA, it's the same thing. The mitochondrial DNA is nothing like the chimpanzee mitochondrial DNA. And what we have is one woman, just like here, one man, low variation, fast mutation rate, explosive growth from a center point, evidence of a rapidly growing population, exactly what we'd expect from the Bible. And so it's you can't ask for better evidence than this. You can't ask for any better evidence than this. This tree is only a reflection of dozens of mutations, with the most being 100 or more on your highest branches. So you take any two people, and we're only separated by between 20 and 25 mutations. That's the mean. Okay, that's the average. That's very, very low. That's a trivial amount of diversity to explain in biblical time. It fits perfectly within the separate ancestry model, the biblical time frame. So what do we have? Evidence for one man, Y chromosome Noah, that gave rise to all the men in the world. And we have evidence for what? One female that gave rise to every single woman on the planet, mitochondrial Eve. The diversity in both of these DNA compartments tell us that these DNA compartments are young. They tell us that universal common ancestry is false. And they confirm separate ancestry. They confirm a literal Adam and Eve. They confirm a literal Adam, Eve, and Noah. Noah being our last Y chromosomal ancestor. Now notice this. Notice the HVR haplogroup. This is the most common in Europe. Okay. And what you'll notice, these branches, you can count up the mutations on these branches. The evolutionists are going to assume that the branches equal time. Remember, they use assumption-based methods, which I'm going to get into a little bit more in this video. But here in this haplogroup, the HVR haplogroup, we actually have all of these branches. Okay, all these people, they go back to a female ancestor, one female ancestor. You see branching patterns all throughout this phylogenetic tree. Now, if all these people represented by these branches came from a common ancestor in the past, and notice here, if you can see my cursor, the branch lengths, since they equal the number of mutations, this tells us that that in the same amount of time, in the same family, they're picking up twice as many mutations as their closest living relatives. People existing at the same time that have more mutations, they've picked up more mutations than their cousins. What this tells us is there is no evolutionary molecular clock. This refutes the evolutionary molecular clock because we have people that are picking up more mutations than other people in the same amount of time. Therefore, we can't do what the evolutionists do and make assumptions that are based on a constant rate. They can't assume the age of these specific branches based on their lengths and therefore the number of mutations. Because again, there is no strict molecular clock. The mutation rate is variable. And we can see that on this unrooted tree that naturally allows the branches to spread out. It's a representation of mitochondrial DNA variation worldwide. And so what do we know? Again, we know that there exists extremely low variation in both the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA. The mutation rates are fast, a lot faster than the evolutionary community ever predicted, between 0.1 and 0.5 per generation for the mitochondrial DNA, between 1 and 3 for the Y chromosome. Way too fast to be explained by the evolutionary time scale. There should be way more differences. And what we're talking about here is not necessarily substitution. We're talking about how you have divergence from an original sequence, how these different groups of people over time are picking up more mutations and they're diverging. These random mutations in people groups over time. And so we can, and here's where I want to go to a paper that I have here. This is by Dr. Rob Carter. Okay, this is not in a Young Earth Creationist journal. Not that that matters, because we have overwhelming evidence for separate ancestry in Young Earth Creationist journals, secular journals, but your critics want to constantly scoff at creationists, saying, oh, you know, creationists don't publish in secular journals. You're going to see throughout this series dozens of papers published in secular journals by Young Earth Creationist PhDs. Okay. So here's the thing. This is a paper, Nucleic Acids Research, Mitochondrial Diversity Within Modern Human Populations. Guys, we know Eve. We literally have her sequence. And most evolutionists, the majority of evolutionists don't know this. And you pull this out on them and they really struggle. Okay, so again, I point out that the mitochondrial DNA, it's uniparentally inherited, but it's a tiny part of our genome. It's only about 16,000 letters. It's transmitted through the woman's side. And just like the Y chromosome, all women today have a nearly identical mitochondrial DNA sequence. And this is when comparing living people, living women and their mitochondrial DNA to the woman that we've all descended from. And you're saying, what? And I'm saying, yes, we literally know Eve. We have identified the Eve sequence, and it has been published in a secular, in the secular literature. And that's what we have here. And basically, so this paper was published in 2007. Okay. And it's directly published the Eve consensus sequence. And so this is compelling, and it provides us a very thorough description of Eve's mitochondrial sequence. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, what does that mean? Consensus sequence. Maybe it's a little confusing, technical. And basically what Rob Carter did, Dr. John Sanford was involved as well, is Dr. Carter specifically took a database of mitochondrial chromosomes from around the world. Okay, he aligned them all, and he was able to discover where the mutations were by doing this. Because remember, you have people accumulating mutations diverging from one another. That's why between any two people, you have roughly 20 to 25 DNA differences separating any two people. That's a very small amount. That's trivial. That's trivial. And so by doing this, by looking at this, we can find a consensus sequence. And that's what he found here. Now, an illustration that should be helpful is, let's say we handed out a document to 100 different people, and then we ask them to copy it manually. Hey, each person, you've got a document, and I want you to copy that document that you have, but copy it manually. And what we would find when we analyze the copies of these documents is we're going to find mistakes in every single copy written out by hand by each person. And with this, we can now go through the copies, we can analyze them, and we can pick out the rare deviants. We can pick out the mistakes. And then by removing them, we can therefore find the original sequence. And so that's what was done here. And what was discovered was roughly only 21 mitochondrial DNA mutations per person. What this means, guys, is that we have about 21 mutations each that are separating us from Eve, because we have about 21 mutations that are different from the Eve consensus sequence. And so let's see here, 16,569 letters, and the consensus by about 21.6. So very low variation, guys. And again, since the rate of mitochondrial DNA change per generation is variable within people, and it's fast, up to 0.5 per generation, then that means that the mitochondrial DNA compartment, just like the Y chromosome, is young. It is the only way to explain it. Okay, so the same thing here. The Y chromosome is showing us variable mutation rates, differing size branches that go back to a common ancestor, indicating that people are picking up more mutations in the same amount of time. Okay, this shouldn't be difficult for the evolutionists to understand, but they're still going to parrot the exact same argument that it needs to be rooted, because they want an artificial look at the data rather than a natural look at the data. Well, you know what? There is no way to take these DNA compartments back 200,000 years. No, it's exactly what we would expect as a biblical creationist. Okay, so again, for anybody listening, I know some of this can be technical, but the branches on these trees, they have mutations. We can count them up, and it doesn't matter how long the branch is, because that doesn't necessarily tell us the age of the branch, which is what the evolutionists are assuming. But the fact that we have variable mutation rates destroys that assumption. We know which mutation has led to each branch, and the length of the branches are incredibly easy to explain in a biblical time scale. We can get this number of mutations in biblical time. And, we talk about fixation rates. Fixation just means to get stuck in place. Well, when you have a when you have a very large population, then you're not going to have a lot of fixation, because people are spread out all over the planet. But when you have small populations, you have rapid fixation and mutations. So what's amazing is the evolutionists have no real feasible way to explain why the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA have incredibly low variation in light of their fast mutation rates. Okay. And, they'll try and point to examples in the Canary Islands or from ancient Rome with ancient DNA, and it doesn't work, because again, let's say you're looking at an island population where you're going to have low diversity anyways. You have isolated people essentially, and the rates are variable. Okay. And so it doesn't matter, because you're looking at these isolated cases. The evolutionists want to do so to say that we have a slow mutation rate, but you want to look at worldwide diversity. And that's what we see here. And that's what can be compared to here. Okay, the phylogenetic approach, guys, so the evolutionists, what they want to do is calibrate the data, calibrate to the geologic column, calibrate to archaeology, And the second you hear the word calibrate, you understand that there's some evolutionary based assumptions going on. Okay. So they want to look to the phylogenetic rate rather than the per generation rate or pedigree rate or empirical rate. And again, there's a few assumptions. They assume the strict molecular clock, which we've destroyed here. It assumes a common ancestry between humans and chimpanzees. And so what they'll do is basically count up the number of DNA differences or mutations between, let's say, humans and chimpanzees, because they'll say that our closest cousin is the chimpanzee, and we and the chimpanzee shared a common ancestor between 6 and 10 million years ago. They push it back. They've pushed the time scale back a little bit over time because there's what's called a waiting time problem, where the DNA differences that are separated between the two groups, humans and chimpanzees, it takes a long time to essentially accumulate the necessary number of beneficial mutations and then fix them. Okay, there's a huge problem, and there's a rock solid paper published by Dr. John Sanford that I will go over in future episodes, published in the secular literature, that shows this waiting time problem. It really is an unsolvable problem at this point for the evolutionary model. But nonetheless, they're going to take the number of DNA differences separating humans and chimpanzees and then look at the time, let's say 6 or 7 million years, and then they're going to divide it by the time, and then they get a very slow mutation rate. Okay, but there's a few problems with that. Okay, so firstly, it makes evolutionary based assumptions. But when they say, oh, you can't look at the per generation rate, you got to look at the fixation rate or the substitution rate. Okay, well, firstly, over time, your mutation rate, let's say it's 1 per generation, it's going to equal a fixation rate in a large population over enough amount of time. The biblical model is perfect because what we have is a rapidly expanding population after the flood. And you have a rapidly expanding population for several hundred years at least that are isolated at Babel, and they don't spread out into all parts of the globe. But that's what God wants people to do at that time, is spread out. And so he confuses the language, but everything leading up to the spreading out, to the Babel dispersal, the out of Babel dispersal, what we have is a fast mutation rate acting upon smaller populations that are isolated, and therefore we have faster rates of fixation. So we have a fast mutation rate right after the flood, rapid fixation events. Okay, faster fixation events. And therefore, what we see in terms of the variation worldwide anyways is perfectly explained in just 4,500 years. Okay, now here's the thing. Basic population genetics will tell you, and a lot of these evolutionists, they don't understand this, and it's why, you know, they parrot. It's like a parrot that they just repeat from their favorite evolutionists. Okay, and I can name a few that have been corrected over and over again, but they refuse it. And they'll just say, you can't use the observed mutation rate, you have to use the evolutionary based phylogenetic rate. But here, okay, firstly, most mutations are neutral, but we actually understand they're mostly nearly neutral. They're only slightly damaging. Selection can't see them, and therefore they're subject to genetic drift. I'm going to be having a whole episode on genetic entropy, which destroys evolution, puts shelf lives on genomes, but not for this episode. But why this applies is you have nearly neutral mutations that are unselectable. They're invisible to selection, and so they spread throughout the population. Now, yes, many are lost to genetic drift, but many are also not lost. Here's an analogy or an illustration that, it kind of comes to mind right now. It might not be perfect, but think of a mountain or even a hill where you just have millions of people climbing up that hill. Well, you're going to have a lot of people that can't quite make it up to the top of the hill. You have a lot of people that fall off the hill. But at the same time, with that many people, you're also going to have a lot of people that make it up to the hill, at the top of the hill. And you can picture the top of the hill, essentially, a representation of fixation. So yes, a lot of mutations are lost over time, but in a large population where we're inheriting a lot of mutations, those mutations stick around, they spread, and could eventually be fixated. But nonetheless, when we're coming to looking at the mitochondrial DNA, the Y-chromosome, we're talking about how we as people are diverging from that consensus sequence. We're diverging from each other. And when you actually look at the DNA differences separating people in the mitochondrial DNA, it's only between 20 and 25. That's nothing. Again, that's trivial. Okay, so these arguments don't work. These arguments don't work because the rate of fixation of neutral mutations that selection can't see, and so they spread, but they're still slightly deleterious, but they're just not deleterious or damaging enough for selection to see. Yeah, if you have some big mutation that hits the mitochondrial DNA and, kills a person before they can reproduce, then selection has removed that mutation from the equation. Or if somebody's hit with a mutation in the embryo and that person obviously dies in the embryonic stages of life, then they're not going to pass on their genes either. These are big mutations. Selection can see big mutations. Selection can get rid of them. But since most mutations are nearly neutral, they accumulate. And yes, through genetic drift, a lot are lost, but many are not. And it's the many that are not, the ones that float around, the ones that could reach fixation. For one, they degenerate. But nonetheless, we have a lot of mutations accumulating in the human population with only low variation. That's a problem. That's a problem. So the rate of fixation of neutral mutations in a population actually equals the neutral mutation rate. And so look at it this way. If the rate of mutation accumulation is 1 per generation, let's go with the lower number for the Y chromosome, 1 per generation. And let's say you have 1 million individuals. Well, the population of 1 million individuals will be substituting 1 letter in its genome every generation because of neutral mutations. And so this argument doesn't work that says, well, you can't look at the observed mutation rate, because this argument that's parroted, because we have to be looking at the substitution rate. It doesn't work. And you can even look at known historical events and archaeology, like, these evolutionists want to do at the Canary Islands. Still doesn't work. Plus, in an isolated islander population, you might actually have more bigger mutations that are seen by selection. And so that population might harbor lower genetic variation, lower numbers of genetic variation, more mutations might be removed in that population. So we got to look at worldwide DNA variation, look at the overall mutation rate in people today, and this is where we can get a consistent number and a valid conclusion. That conclusion is separate ancestry, a literal Adam and Eve, a young genome. And you're not going to find any of your, especially your theistic evolutionists, that want to twist the scriptures and argue that it's not saying what it's saying, that we do essentially go back to, pre-human like ancestors or people outside the garden. No, that doesn't work, because the evidence suggests that we all came from 1 man and 1 woman. And Dr. Jensen, he's taken it as far here, and this could be the case too, where you have the 3 major haplogroups, L, M, and N. That's what these are, L, M, and N. Okay. And you can see how all your branches go back to these 3 major haplogroups. Well, this is the mitochondrial DNA. So think about this. You have, and it's up for debate, because maybe the R haplogroup is, one of Noah's daughters-in-laws, or it could be a post-Babel dispersal event. So there's some amazing research here. But anyways, he's pointed out L, M, and N, 3 major haplogroups, where R could be a post-Babel dispersal event. Okay, so you're still left with the 3 major haplogroups. And yet we have Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives, but mitochondrial DNA is passed down on the mother's side. And yet we all came from those 3 reproducing couples. And so you have 3 main haplogroups, and therefore we would have came with coexisting women, the 3 wives of Noah's sons. That is pretty amazing. They have 3 major haplogroups, and the Bible tells us that essentially every single woman on the planet today came from those 3 women. And we as men would all come from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Okay, because remember, the lines on the branches don't necessarily represent time, but represent DNA differences. And because L, M, and N are separated by just short branch lengths, what that tells us is that these 3 women were only separated by a few mutations. And so they could have certainly lived at the exact same time. And this is pretty amazing. Now, I want to point out another model, and this has to apply with the Y chromosome. Another reason why we can't trust the molecular clock. And this is called patriarchal drive. Okay. And patriarchal drive basically points out the fact that biblical patriarchs would be having kids at really old ages. You know, Dr. Rob Carter has basically said the mutations that are passed on from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, their genetics would have been genetic poison because they're living hundreds of years. Noah's living hundreds of years in the post-flood world where you have a massive shift in environment, especially. And therefore, more mutations could be passed on. Okay, because if you have really old people like the biblical patriarchs, Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth, for example, they're having children later in their lives. Well, they're going to produce children that have a ton of mutations in that one generation. And so if we look at a long branch that's closer to the flood rather than today, closer to the flood, then that could indicate one generation where that generation was hit with a ton of mutations rather than being many generations or deep time. Okay, and the reason for this, guys, is because we know, and why it specifically applies to Y chromosome, is because men's reproductive cells, our cells start dividing at puberty, but they don't actually stop dividing until we die. And so we as men, we can have older children, we can have children later in life. And patriarchal drive is so important because it means that early biblical patriarchs could be producing kids with very long branch lengths right at the beginning, right after the flood. And so you have these abnormally long branches for hundreds of years after the flood until the age essentially decreases to, let's say, less than 100, where the evolutionists are going to look at the branch lengths and they're going to assume that this is time. So you have variable mutation rates. You have patriarchal drive as a possible factor. Okay. And what's interesting too is the evolutionists, they'll point to African diversity, not understanding that, you know, Africans have more PRDM9 genes, which I'm going to get into a little bit as I wrap this up. Mutation rate, or African populations have a very interesting history. And there's paper after paper that discusses just how interesting, you know, their history is, the environmental conditions that African tribes have been subjected to. But you could have had populations founded by early biblical patriarchs who moved into Africa after Babel, still living hundreds of years and passing on more mutations. And if you have isolated tribes within Africa, we have this massive dumping of new mutations, but also a small population. Well, with founder effects and, you know, rapid fixation, you're going to have essentially each tribe becoming unique, having their own set of DNA markers. Okay. So just because Africans have more mutations, more diversity, longer branches, doesn't necessarily tell us that they're an older population. Okay. And this is where I want to talk about. So right here, pedigree-based mutation rate, just to solidify this here. Notice this, and this is from 2022. Pedigree-derived mutation rate across the entire mitochondrial genome. Estimates of the mutation rate with a non-phylogenetic approach, which is the pedigree analysis. Count up those differences, grandparents, parents, child, are reported to be approximately tenfold. Notice that, tenfold higher than phylogenetically derived rates. And it's circular. They want to assume archaeology. They want to assume ape to man ancestry. They want to assume the geologic column when those are the points in question. So they're assuming their model to essentially prove their model. Okay, notice this, hypermutation. Guys, hypermutation is a reality. What does this say? This is 2022 paper. 2 families had genetic drivers of germline hypermutation, with fathers carrying damaging genetic variation in DNA repair genes. So you have mutations to important DNA repair genes, which could be due to environment. That's what we know. Environment can drive hypermutation. And if DNA repair enzymes are hit, that means more mutations are going to be passed on. More mutations will accumulate in the somatic cell lines. Those aren't passed on. But mutation accumulation is a major reason why we die. And then in the germ cell lines, they can be more can accumulate and be passed on simply because you have DNA repair enzymes that are damaged, that are destroyed due to mutations. Okay. So hypermutation is a real thing. Variable mutation rates, patriarchal drive, hypermutation, which could be due to a number of reasons, mutations to important DNA repair enzymes, and also environment. Okay, notice this, environment can influence mutation rates. 2022, environmental exposures in parents, such as ionizing radiation, can influence the number of mutations transmitted to offspring. Guys, the drastic changes after the flood, the entire real estate of the earth is altered. Okay, you have increased levels of radiation, right? There'd be a lot of heat and energy released during the flood. The harsh environmental conditions, especially in the post-flood ice age, all of these factors, your Neanderthals, which I'm going to do an entire episode on as well, them being isolated in these harsh ice age related conditions, isolated to small numbers, essentially, with these harsh founder effects that can result in lots of genetic diseases, mutations, homozygosity. Well, that can all result in what? Hypermutation, more mutations accumulating, and therefore longer branches on these phylogenetic trees that the evolutionists want to say, oh, that's indicative of time. When in fact, no, that is not necessarily the case. So yes, hypermutation exists, which destroys the evolutionary assumptions. And creationists have even gone as far as making testable predictions. Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, for example, a PhD Harvard graduate, he predicted the mutation rate that is not yet known in certain people groups. For example, the Khoisan people groups, he predicted that they would have a faster mutation rate. And, you know, again, mutation rates could also, more mutations could accumulate simply because more generations. You know, if I think it was a UN survey showed that Africans historically generally married at a younger age. And so if they're marrying at, let's say, 15, which is relatively long, then more generations can pass, more mutations. But nonetheless, environment can result in hypermutation. And so even if it's not more generations, more mutations can be passed on, or people groups that are closer to the equator could be hit with more radiation, hit with more problems. And so there's so many factors you have to consider. Notice this, again, 2022 paper. We also found that the overall point mutation rate is somewhat higher. No, significantly higher in Africans than in Europeans in the HBB region studied. In my debate with Grayson, he's trying to say, oh, it's just in that region. And it's like, evolutionists, unfortunately, they have a lot of unsophisticated thinking. They don't make any testable predictions because they are assuming a constant rate. But if you have one region that has a significantly higher mutation rate, not just a moderately higher, but a significantly higher mutation rate, it's pretty absurd to think that that's only the region, right? This region was studied, but as time goes on, we'll study more regions. And even with that specific region that's accumulating more mutations, well, that means there's going to be an overall higher mutation rate, okay? And so notice this, our findings, none of these are creationist journals. Our findings imply that defects in DNA repair genes can increase germline mutation rates. Let me read that again. Our findings imply that defects in DNA repair genes can increase germline mutation rates in addition to their well-established impacts on somatic mutation rates. So somatic cell lines and germ cell lines being affected. These post-flood environmental conditions, the radiation associated with it, the harsh conditions, the ice age-related conditions would be essentially your perfect conditions to drive more mutations into the population. Okay, and another thing is your genetic landscapes of these populations, let's say Africans versus non-Africans, they're not necessarily telling us about the age of the population, since there are many factors that can drive or influence genetic landscapes. And why I'm saying this is because we do have differing levels of genetic variation in Africans, more genetic variation, but we also have more pieces of DNA in African populations. And so the evolutionists will say, oh, more pieces of DNA means more recombination. And so more recombination, more pieces of DNA, and older population. Well, recombination is a process by which pieces of DNA are broken and recombined to produce what? We talked about this earlier. With created heterozygosity, produce new combinations of alleles. Okay. But what the evolutionists fail to understand is that we actually have a very interesting DNA element. Okay, this is a gene. It's called the PRDM9 gene, and it's a driver of the genetic map. So remember, genetic landscapes are altered based on a number of factors. And the evolutionists have these assumptions that these factors are always constant. For example, mutation rate or recombination rates. And so we have this PRDM9 gene, and it's actually designed, its job is to look for a specific set of letters on the chromosome. And when it finds those letters, it grabs onto it and then recombines. And the fact is, African populations actually have more PRDM9 sites than Europeans. And because PRDM9 elements are drivers of genetic landscapes, and more recombination per generation means a population therefore has the ability to harbor more genetic diversity, well, populations undergoing more recombination will consist of what? More pieces of DNA. And notice this, the landscape of recombination. It talks about how the larger number of hotspots available to West Africans, it's talking about the PRDM9 alleles, and they occur at greatly increased frequency in people of West African ancestry, have led to a shift in the recombination landscape compared with people of non-African ancestry. Thus, the shorter extent of West African linkage disequilibrium, notice this, is not due to differences in demographic history alone, such as the lack of an out of Africa founder event. So what do we have? We have recombination rates that are driving, we have recombination rates that are faster in Africans, which means because you have more of these PRDM9 genes, and mutations, they can destroy these sites. And every time a mutation destroys a site, there's one less site or one less gene available, essentially, DNA element available for recombination. Okay, so you have this specific populations like the Africans here that are able to harbor more genetic diversity over periods of time. They've had an interesting history. And so it doesn't necessarily tell us that they're an older population. Notice this, PRDM9 influences the possibility of genetic exchange by determining the locations of meiotic recombination hotspots in most mammals. So there's paper after paper here, guys. I've actually done a whole video, probably about 6 months ago, possibly, on this specific topic. So basically, I'll wrap this specific topic up with this. More scrambling in a population means that population can harbor more genetic diversity. Go back to Adam and Eve. They were created with high levels of heterozygosity. They were created and front-loaded with DNA elements that are functional and beneficial. They have more hotspots. They have more working PRDM9 genes. They have more effective recombination, gene conversion. There's a lot of study going on with gene conversion as well that possibly tells us more heterozygosity means more gene conversion or more effective gene conversion. And so if you go back to Adam and Eve, where they have increased levels of genetic diversity and heterozygosity with no mutations, then you're going to have faster recombination rates, more effective scrambling, both in terms of recombination and gene conversion. Gene conversion is essentially able to swap single nucleotides, which is very interesting. And so, yeah, this PRDM9, it controls recombination. African genomes have more PRDM9 sites than non-Africans. And therefore, what does this tell us historically? Well, there could have been more recombination in specific populations that were going into Africa after the Tower of Babel dispersal. And those populations going into Africa that have more working PRDM9 genes and sites will be able to harbor more genetic diversity. And so, It really is just an amazing time to be a biblical creationist because we have such amazing data, genetic data, that's just confirming our model more and more every day. So here's the last thing I want to discuss in episode 1. So as you can tell, this one was comprehensive. Can't promise you every single episode will be this long, but there's a lot to cover. And this is just 1% of the entire series, guys. There's so much to cover. So again, we talked a lot about Y chromosome, mitochondrial DNA. And so we have the Y chromosome, incredibly low variation, but it turns out that the Y chromosome between humans and gorillas is more similar than when comparing humans and chimpanzees. When comparing human and chimpanzee Y chromosome, guess what? It's only about 35% the same when you consider overall size differences, architecture, gene content. Here's a visual here for you from this important paper that I highly recommend. The Y chromosomes of the great apes, and then link to the picture here. Notice the human Y chromosome. Compare the human Y chromosome here. This is the chimpanzee Y. Guys, the Y chromosome between human males is nearly identical and a fast mutation rate, yet we find no highly divergent Y chromosome groups on the planet. Low variation, one Y chromosome ancestor. Look at the chimpanzee, half the size, completely different, nothing alike. And apparently the chimpanzee is our closest cousin. Now look at the gorilla. They love to talk about their nested hierarchy. There's no consistent hierarchy here. Notice we would say the chimpanzee and the bonobo go back to a common, let's say, archetype, ancestor, right? My separate ancestry model would say you've got the human kind, chimpanzee and bonobo kind, which would go back to an archetype, gorilla kind, and then orangutan kind. And the Y chromosomes of these creatures, of these kinds, demonstrates exactly what I'm saying. Because even though the bonobo Y chromosome is different than the chimpanzee Y, it's not that different, especially when you compare it to the human Y or the gorilla Y. The gorilla Y and the human Y are much more alike than the chimpanzee and bonobo. And you have people like, Gutsy Gibbon and some of these more popular militant evolutionists. They want to say, well, no, the human and the gorilla Y are not more similar when, you compare X, Y, Z. And it's like, no, we want to compare everything. Okay. Because they want to make assumptions on what happened after the various splits and the branching that has taken place. Okay. No, what we look at is the entirety of the Y chromosome. It's half the size. So already it's starting 50% the same. Again, here's the human Y, here's the chimpanzee Y. Chimpanzee and bonobo Y are pretty similar, which makes sense that they go back to original created kind. Gorilla is its own kind. Notice the gorilla Y. Again, it's an inconsistent hierarchy because your human Y and your gorilla Y are more similar to each other than human and chimpanzee Y. Guys, the reasoning for this is separate ancestry, and this alone refutes universal common ancestry. The Y chromosome, for the most part, is non-recombining DNA. It should be relatively more stable. We know that the human Y chromosome mutates fast, low variation. And so since it's accumulating a lot of mutations per generation, but it's still basically the same worldwide, that means it's young. It hasn't had enough time to accumulate a lot of differences. Notice this. Despite a recent divergence of these species, this is from an evolutionary paper in 2020, not a creationist. Dynamic evolution of great ape Y chromosomes. Notice this guy, it's fascinating. So they're assuming evolution in their paper as always. They're assuming there was a divergence event, but this is fascinating what they say, what they admit. Despite a recent divergence of these species, roughly 7 million years ago, their Y chromosomes differ moderately. No, enormously in size and gene content. Guys, the Y chromosomes between humans and chimpanzees, nothing alike. You have people who are so unsophisticated, who haven't done any study on this type of stuff at all. Aaron Ra, who's got his phylogeny challenge. And it's like the best arguments debunking his phylogeny challenge he's not familiar with. Come on, Aaron Ra, let's see you put out a video on the Y chromosome dissimilarity between humans and chimpanzees. There's a challenge for you. Now, they'll come up with a lot of stories and hypotheses, and they take the stories directly from the paper itself, the original paper. I think it was in 2006 or 7, where it talks about how the chimpanzee and human Y chromosomes are incredibly divergent. And in that paper, they give up some plausible reasons, but they're untested. They're hypotheses. Maybe sperm competition in chimpanzees leave chimpanzees as the odd man out, or maybe faster rates of gene conversion or faster mutation rates. Okay, thanks for the story. Cool story, bro. But let's actually get the math. Let's get a model. Let's get some empirical evidence. Don't just give me stories. It's post hoc, ad hoc, like the out of Africa population bottleneck. Notice this. For example, the chimpanzee Y is only half the size of the human Y. So any evolutionist that keeps denying that, this is right from your literature. It's half the size. It already starts off 50% different. It's like taking two pieces of paper and just ripping one in half and then comparing the two. One's already 50% different. The percentage of gene families shared by these two chromosomes that split about 6 million years ago is similar to that shared by, notice this, human and chicken autosomes that split 310 million years ago. Now, autosomes, recombining DNA, biparentally inherited DNA. So it's not the same, but it's just showing how shocked they were. The human Y is more similar. Notice this. They admit this right in the paper, guys. The human Y is much more similar to the gorilla Y than to the chimpanzee Y. No consistent hierarchy. This is directly from the paper in 2010. Chimpanzee and Y chromosomes are remarkably divergent in structure and gene content. Notice this. The chimpanzee MSY, this is right from their literature, guys. We are destroying universal ancestry and confirming separate ancestry directly from the evolutionary literature. The chimpanzee MSY harbors twice as many massive palindromes as the human MSY. Yet it has lost, so they assume there's been this massive loss. They can't even question their basic assumption of ancestry. Maybe humans and chimpanzees don't go back to a common ancestor, and this is based on so many lines of evidence that's going to take me 50 hours to get through. Yet it has lost large fractions of the MSY protein coding genes and gene families present in the last common ancestor. Surprisingly, however, more than 30% of chimpanzee MSY sequence has no homologous, alignable counterpart in the human MSY. There's massive portions of the chimpanzee Y sequence that doesn't even have a homologue or anything to compare to in the human MSY. They're totally different, guys. They're totally different. What are the differences? There are two main classes of MSY sequences shared between the two species, ampliconic and X-degenerate. Humans also have X-transposed sequences, but the chimp does not. The X-degenerate regions of chimp and man differ by a full 10%. This is huge. This is massive, considering the so-called 99% identical claim that we have heard parroted. They love to parrot, these evolutionists, so often over the previous several decades. But this is only the beginning of the differences. To compare the ampliconic regions, they had to appeal to extensive rearrangement and rampant sequence gain and loss. You see how now they got to look at the Y chromosomes because it fits perfectly with the separate ancestry model that I showed you at the beginning in terms of the separate ancestry phylogeny, where you have chimpanzees and bonobos, one created kind, orangutan, gorilla, and humans. And we can see this simply based on the Y chromosomes. So there's massive differences, size differences, sizable differences. Okay. The amount of difference in the Y chromosome between humans and chimpanzees was a huge surprise. And was the difference expected between human and chicken autosomes? So you can read all this yourself. Check these sources, guys. I'm going to start winding it down here. And here's the last slide I want to touch on. And this is episode 1, guys. This was fun. Pass it around, watch it a couple times, digest the information, and it's a great time to be a biblical creationist. So these guys, these evolutionists that want to post hoc, ad hoc, rationalize their way out of this, it ain't gonna work. It ain't gonna work. Okay. They can put forth their sperm competition arguments. They can put forth their increased rates of gene conversion, whatever they want. But you are going to have to apply mathematical models to try to demonstrate how a sequence can change extremely rapidly, including wholesale rearrangement of significant parts and the evolution of what? entire gene families in a relatively short amount of time, yet stay homogeneous within a species. This is going to be very difficult for them. Guys, even in gene expression, because even in the similar sequences between humans and chimpanzees, there's still massive differences in terms of gene expression, gene regulation, alternative splicing, epigenetics, the 3D genome's different. And I'm going to touch on all of that in subsequent episodes, guys. And we're going to wrap it up here. That was a ton of fun. Episode 1. And it's so funny, guys, because these evolutionists, they'll say there's no evidence for separate ancestry, or they'll invoke some kind of phylogeny challenge. And yet when you present them these arguments, they've got no response. They've got no sophisticated rebuttal. They've got no model. Refute the data, refute the model, show us a more superior model. Because everything that I've shown you in episode 1 here is perfectly in line with what? Separate ancestry model as demonstrated here. So with that, guys, episode 1 concludes, and I hope you enjoyed it. Let's see how long we went. Hour and 40 minutes. So there we go. Episode 1, a literal Adam and Eve, guys. Share this around. As I've said 10 times in this show, it's a great time to be a biblical creationist. So with that, guys, God bless, and Stand for Truth is out.